Hi everyone and welcome back to Heimler's History. Now in the course of the last few lectures we've seen how the North and the South have been tumbling down the hill towards disunion and eventually civil war. Stephen Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act was particularly incendiary, but in this lecture we're going to see the final straw that broke the camel's back, and then punched the camel in the face, and then deliberately hurt the camel's feelings. Let's get to it.
It's time to kick it old school.
So what further causes can we attribute to the United States devolving into civil war? Well, let's start with Harriet Beecher Stowe. Stowe was a staunch abolitionist and was entirely vexed by the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. So she wrote a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which laid bare the brutality and cruelty of slavery. The success of this novel was astonishing. It went into printing after printing after printing. To millions of Northern Americans, Uncle Tom's Cabin supplied their imaginations with the horrors of slavery that they hadn't yet been able to conceive. And as a result of this, thousands upon thousands of Northerners boldly proclaimed that they would no longer have anything to do with the Fugitive Slave Act. Add to all of that, Kansas. You may recall that under the provisions of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that Kansas could decide for itself by popular sovereignty whether or not to allow slavery in its house. Well, when the time came for Kansas to elect a territorial government, a crisis occurred. On election day, a bunch of pro-slavery folks from Missouri rushed across the border to vote for a pro-slavery government in Kansas, and they won. But the Free Soilers, not surprisingly, cried foul and set up their own government in Topeka. And now the Kansans are very confused, because do they submit to a government that was established by fraud, or do they submit to a government established illegally? But things got even worse in Kansas. In 1856, after some heated disputes over some land claims, some pro-slavery thugs went to the town of Lawrence, which happened to be free soil, and shot it up and burned it. And that conflict ushered to the stage John I Kill Kittens Just by Looking at Them Brown. John Brown was the fiercest of abolitionists, and upon hearing of the burning of Lawrence, he gathered a group of his own thugs and found a group of pro-slavery folks and literally hacked them to pieces. And upon hearing about this, more pro-slavery folks retaliated, and a little civil war broke out in Kansas that would eventually fold itself into the larger civil war a few years later. This little episode became known as Bleeding Kansas, and the tension that it caused eventually erupted in the halls of Congress as well. In that same year, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts rose in Congress and delivered a blistering speech called The Crime Against Kansas. In this speech, he condemned pro-slavery Kansans as hirelings picked from the drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization. So, he was kind of neutral on the subject. And in this speech, he also insulted South Carolina, which, as it turns out, was a mistake. In response to Sumner's degrading comments, South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks walked over to where Sumner sat at his desk and beat him unconscious with his cane until it broke. At the news of this, Southerners rejoiced, and they began sending Brooks replacement canes, some of them gold-plated, just in case he had to break open somebody else's skull. So we can see that emotion and canes quickly replaced well-reasoned debate on the slavery issue. And now, Bleeding Kansas was joined to Bleeding Congressmen. And there's so much more. Let's talk about the infamous Supreme Court case Dred Scott versus Stanford. And the case itself was pretty simple. Dred Scott was a slave who had been taken by his master to live for 5 years in the free territories of Illinois and Wisconsin. And with a bunch of interested abolitionists supporting him, Scott sued for his freedom because of his long residence on free soil. Now, the court justices leaned heavily towards Southern sympathy and handed down the following decision. 1. Dred Scott was a slave and not a citizen, and therefore had no right to sue in federal court. 2. Because a slave is private property, then that property is protected by the Fifth Amendment, and therefore a slaveholder can take his property wherever he likes without the fear of losing it. Now, Republicans in the North were infuriated by this decision and refused to abide by its strictures. And Southerners began to wonder how long they could remain joined to a nation that refused to submit to the decisions of the highest court of the land. And in the middle of all this turmoil, a senatorial race began in Illinois in 1858. Now, Stephen Douglas currently held the seat, but a lanky backwoods lawyer by the name of Abraham Lincoln decided that he would run against Douglas. Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of debates, which seemed like folly because Douglas was the fiercest debater in the land. But Lincoln, while not nearly as powerful an orator, cornered Douglas with his precise logic. Suppose for a minute, Lincoln asked Douglas, that the people of a particular territory vote against slavery by virtue of popular sovereignty. The Dred Scott decision prohibited them from doing that because now masters could bring slaves into any territory they wanted with no recourse. So who would prevail, Lincoln demanded, the court or the people? Mic drop! Now, despite this, Lincoln still lost the senatorial seat to Douglas. However, it did have the effect of thrusting Lincoln into the public eye, where he gained the attention of some very prominent Republicans. Meanwhile, in the South, let's check in with the kitten slayer John Brown. After studying various slave revolutions, he decided to gather a few folks together and incite a slave rebellion of his own. John Brown's little band raided the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with the intent of distributing guns and ammunition to slaves across the South. He did so and killed 7 innocent people in the process, and his plot was quickly squashed by the U.S. Marines. Now, Brown was convicted of treason and sentenced to death, but far from fearing his fate, Brown gladly embraced it, since he knew by instinct that he could advance the abolitionist cause further by martyrdom than he could by armed resistance. And as John Brown plunged through the trap door on the gallows, he hung as a powerful symbol for both abolitionists and Southerners. The abolitionists were inflamed with a new passion for the cause. The Southerners again wondered how long they could remain part of a nation that, at least in the Southern mind, endorsed armed raids on their way of life. And now we come to the presidential election of 1860. The Republicans put forward Abraham Lincoln as their candidate. The Democrats split themselves between a couple of different candidates, almost ensuring their defeat. And when the votes were tallied, Lincoln had won in a landslide without a single vote from the South. And the Southerners thought that Lincoln's game was to abolish slavery. Now, it wasn't, but that's what they thought. And so in order to preserve their way of life, South Carolina called a special convention and voted to secede from the Union. And as the new year dawned, 6 other states followed South Carolina into secession: Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Now, 4 more states would join them in the spring, bringing the grand total to 11, and ladies and gentlemen, that's how you get the Confederate States of America. And by the way, these secessionist states had good historical precedent for what they were doing. Hadn't all 13 states entered the Union voluntarily? Well, now these 11 were leaving it voluntarily. Hadn't those same 13 colonies seceded from the British Empire when said empire's abuses and usurpations grew too burdensome? Well, these might have been very persuasive arguments for the Southerners, but there was one man who was not persuaded by them, namely President-elect Abraham Lincoln. And we'll pick up his story next time.